So we're moving across the Baltic Sea to some extent. What I want to do here is to bring together two approaches. One is to revisit some work I did a few years ago actually now on water infrastructure in the greater Stockholm region. So sort of quite an empirical piece of field work. Which was situated within a project around, basically, which started out from questions around the costs of urban sprawl, costs not just in an economic framing, but also in the broader environmental and other costs of urban sprawl. So that's a piece of fieldwork that I did 5 years ago, but I also want to revisit that by using some more recent, ongoing and half-baked or perhaps even overcooked to continue the culinary discussion. Reflections, some conceptual reflections that I've been engaged with recently about how to, it's bringing the two together and seeing whether they fit. So continuing this kind of experimental way of doing things, so to speak. So my way into this question of suburban infrastructures, or one way in for me anyway, is the whole notion of the networked city or networked urbanism and its evolutions. So looking empirically and conceptually perhaps beyond an ideal or a model or a paradigm of the traditional growth and extension of technical networks and essential urban services. So not just a focus on centralized networks as some kind of norm which would ignore the outsides of networked urbanism. And I think it's a fair assumption that the suburbs are a major area or a major zone beyond this networked city where there are perhaps configurations and practices, and I think we've begun to see some of them already today. There are configurations and practices of dealing with, planning for, experiencing infrastructure that are long-standing, that are embedded, that are used and accepted, that don't necessarily relate or respond to a networked urbanism ideal, and that by looking at these or beginning to look at these, we might expand and advance our understanding of wider infrastructure transitions and of new, more hybrid and heterogeneous landscapes and territories of socio-technical change through which the urban and suburban political is being made and remade. So one question for me is how to study, how to know, how to account for these suburban infrastructures without assuming that the suburbs are in some way marginal areas and people's in weight, in inverted commas, for the usual urban connections, flows and accessibilities. So I'm going to focus on a municipality, part of the Stockholm archipelago region, where effectively the practical planning policy response to suburban evolution is only partially reliant on extension of centralized networks, where we therefore see some of the limits to networked urbanism, but where the politics of socio-technical change, I would argue, are no less material and salient. So it's perhaps me worth saying first a little about my understanding of and interest in infrastructure, given that urban studies is now starting to engage with notions of infrastructure in some quite distinct ways. So for me, infrastructure is there's something here around and between ideas and notions of socio-technical change, heterogeneous engineering work, material politics. I mean, this is all quite well known. That's to me, infrastructure is engagement with material forms, with technical arrangements, with reconfigured territorialities, where infrastructure is not a passive object, but a lively urban ingredient itself, constituted by a dynamic, contingent set of things, processes, and arrangements. So infrastructure as a loose arrangement or assemblage of different systems, networks of provision, service configurations, rules and norms, finance, material, resource flows, etc., etc. So this materiality of socio-technical systems and infrastructures shape and are both shaping collective action and shaped by collective action. So there's something about the making, the experience, the contestation of urban infrastructure as some kind of kaleidoscopic process of open-ended, non-linear, flexible socio-technical change. This is the study of what appear to be on the surface mundane urban objects, but yet quickly reveal themselves to be captivating mediators of all kinds of relations, flows, symbolisms, powers, and politics. So, in many ways, spoken like the true hybrid that I am myself actually as a kind of UK-trained social scientist, again in a French engineering school, like a lot of other people seem to be. These are very, 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 very technical systems, and I can talk to my colleagues in the engineering school about how technical they are and the ways in which they are technical, and I myself haven't a clue most of the time what they're actually talking about in terms of the techniques and the technologies behind them. But I do understand that there is a need to understand that these systems are exceptionally technical systems, but that they also at the same time mediate or translate some of the crucial political debates around urban futures, around questions of finance and investment, scales of governance, organisation and ownership, socio-spatial solidarities, metabolic flows, etc. So this kind of view focuses on the different ways in which objects, points of contention, policy orientations are made visible, tangible, durable for particular groups through, for example, what Alan Latham and colleagues have called the ordering, circulation and manipulation of things. So the question for me here is very much about the way in which the technical, the material, the infrastructure perhaps becomes in itself political, alive with potential, alive with some kind of agency and power to reshape relations and configurations in particular ways. So the key question is how infrastructure comes to matter in a given situation, a given moment or a given locality, and how it becomes more broadly political or politicized as a result or after. So there's two, in particular two authors who are offering some help and guidance in this study of infrastructural matters and their collective significance. I'm still thinking this through very much, as I said. But it seems to me that both Easterling, who's already been cited today, and Andrew Barry's recent work on material politics offer new takes on the political implications of infrastructure. So Easterling as a way into disposition, a way into the making and the remaking of matters in infrastructure space, focusing on active forms, which shows that infrastructure is always doing something, it always has some kind of potential or establishes some kind of potential. And Andrew Barry's work tracking how particular contested infrastructure configurations are related to or associated with wider political situations, how actors are constantly engaged in translation work relating local matters to broader issues of collective significance. And there's also something here in both Easterling and Barry's work about how making things matter means making something public or transparent, and something also about the production and circulation of information, how this increasing focus on materiality is also bound up in an increasing production of information and knowledge about the materials in question. So that's some kind of vague theoretical reflection as a starting point. Now, moving to Stockholm, so as I said, my way in originally was very much actually this map in some ways, because what this map shows is a map of the greater Stockholm County. It shows how fragmented and diverse it actually is. It also shows the blue areas of which concentrate these centralized technical networks. So municipal and intermunicipal centralized owned access to water and wastewater services. Everything outside of the blue areas, all the people living elsewhere on the islands, in the forests, in the countryside, etc. Everybody living out there has some kind of other, again in inverted commas, some kind of other access to water and wastewater services. So again, even in the context of a major European city region, the provision of water and wastewater services through some kind of centralized system is not necessarily the norm for everybody. So that brings up we can see that again on this table here. There's no universalization of networks. There's about 100,000 people who live off the grid, basically, in the Stockholm region. There's a list here of municipalities where, in some cases, almost half or a good third of people are not connected to municipal or intermunicipal water and wastewater networks. And again, sorry, the regional plan, even one of the a recent regional plan, actually promotes small-scale solutions in sparsely populated areas, which it says may be significantly better than today's systems. So it's neither in practice, in terms of people's accessibility, the way in which they actually have access to water and actually have access to some kind of wastewater service. Neither in practice nor in policy terms is there some kind of norm or ideal of necessarily of a networked provision of these services going on. So the question in many ways, or one starting point here, is what is infrastructure beyond the blue area on the map, beyond the blue centralised dense urban core? What is infrastructure beyond this, beyond the networked city? How do local officials plan for infrastructure beyond these areas? How can they possibly plan an area when you not necessarily have centralised infrastructure to take care of ways of life, etc.? How residents and other actors, perhaps humans and non-humans, contribute to configurations and dispositions, how infrastructure comes to matter here. And I would argue that it's here that this, as soon as you start to go beyond the question, you dig into the question of infrastructure beyond the network city, here you begin to see local matters which are a little bit different to traditional infrastructure questions coming up. So you see disputes between temporary and permanent forms of living, disputes over the environment, disputes over the forms of ecology of particular local areas, over finance, over the particular techniques and technologies used for providing services in sparse, non-dense urban areas, and the wider politics of the socio-technical arrangements in question. So whereas I'm starting off, very much starting off from this question of whether these outer areas of the Stockholm region are beyond infrastructure or perhaps before infrastructure in a traditional normative sense of expecting traditional centralised networks to be extended over time at some point in the future into these areas. It becomes more a question now of modes of residence, which infrastructure obviously supports, makes possible. Evolving modes of residence, because this is a growing area, this is people moving in, this is transformations in the ways in which people are actually living in these areas, which I'm going to come on to, within a context of local and regional discourses of growth, of world-class Stockholm for 2030, reconfigured localities and regionalism, and continued urban extension, some kind of urban extension into rural, sparse, fragile, water-based areas. And then a whole question around regulation, deregulation, re-regulation, both in terms of water issues, but also in terms of land and construction and delivering of permits for construction or permits for extensions to existing homes, etc. So, for example, in terms of modes of residence, as soon as we started to talk to local people or local and regional people around water and wastewater issues in Stockholm, one question came up recurrently was that in the Stockholm archipelago, we had to look at the question of the summer house and the ways in which this was changing modes of residence in the Stockholm archipelago. So there's a cultural question here that in Sweden there's a very particular history of the importance of the summer house. There's a very particular history of the importance of the summer house in the Stockholm region, which is linked to post-war context of wealth in society, which enabled Stockholmers to be able to afford, a large number of Stockholmers to be able to afford to buy a second home in the summer house where they could escape at the weekends or in the holidays. There's a certain symbolic value here we can see, the symbolic value which is often more important than the permanent flat or home that Stockholmers possess in the centre during the week. There's an association that Stockholmers can escape their daily lives or their lives during the week by going to the summer house. And this, in recent times, certainly in the last 15 or 20 years, the summer house has gradually been transformed from a temporary escape from the daily rat race, so to speak, to, in some cases, a more permanent home, basically. Retired people often move out to their summer house when they retire. People who now find it increasingly expensive to live in a Stockholm in the city centre of Stockholm, where it's increasingly expensive to rent or to own your own home, often find that in these kinds of areas it's cheaper or more possible for them, given their personal situations, to actually transform a summer house into some kind of permanent permanent mode of residence. This obviously brings in a whole load of planning questions about, because this is happening on such a scale, up to 1,000, I think planners talk about 1,000 otherwise secondary homes being transformed into permanent homes per year in the whole region. This creates a whole load of planning questions around infrastructure, notably because previously where you have an infrastructure which is configured, 5 minutes? Previously where you have an infrastructure which is configured for part-time residents, then transforming large-scale transformation of an area into, with a large number of full-time residents, actually transforms the way in which infrastructure, notably water and wastewater, has to be provided. And I'm going to have to accelerate. As per usual. So that's, I've already mentioned that, Stockholm County. So what I'm going to focus on very, very briefly in 2 minutes flat is basically the archipelago area, which, archipelago obviously the islands to the right-hand side. These two particular, everything I've been saying, two particular municipalities, Värmdö and Norrtälje, have been particularly affected by this transformation in modes of residence. And I'm going to focus, I was going to focus a little bit on Norrtälje municipality, which is a municipality where population is perceived, well, it's growing, and it's going to be growing, or it's perceived to be going to be growing to 2030. This is a single municipality, one of 26 municipalities in the Stockholm region, but which takes up a third of Stockholm's land surface, but yet has a density of less than 30 people per kilometres squared. So as the photo suggests, this is a water-based area. This is a very sparse, fragile environment with not many people and not many homes. And it also has a population which is greater during the summer months than actually the permanent population in the whole municipality. I think there are more summer houses actually on the territory of the municipality than there are actual permanent full-time homes. And 45%, as I said, 45% of households beyond the local network, which brings up a whole series of environmental issues. Plus a municipality which wants to attract people and which opens up areas of the coast to construction. So there's a very liberal urban policy. So new constructions, for example, on the coast, plus this dynamic of what we're calling permanentisation, which is not a very nice word, but which is a literal translation of a Swedish term. Plus new water and wastewater norms coming from Europe, coming from the national Swedish government, and the regulation operated by the local municipality. The need for new water resources has led to some kind of municipality strategy which has subdivided the whole municipality into 3 types of zones. So a zone of development where the centralised networks should be extended because they're close to existing pipes and existing installations. Zones in transformation, which I've been talking about, where there's this change of mode of residence, and zones for treatment where there's particular environmental problems of infiltration, eutrophication, leaching, etc. There's a whole series of technical and environmental questions about the infiltration of salt water into wells or the seeping from septic tanks or from wastewater solutions into the Baltic Sea, which creates a whole series, obviously, of major environmental problems. And this has led to an infrastructure investment program. It's also led to, but not just an infrastructure investment program, there's also been in areas not as close to centralised networks, there's also been the development of intermediate solutions, which are not quite autonomous wells and septic tanks in the gardens, but also communities or collectives coming together to create mini networks, either between themselves or mini networks which are connected at one point to a municipal infrastructure. And there's in large parts of the region as well, there will still be there's some kind of regulation of individual solutions. So there's no, as I was saying, there's no expectation that the network is just going to be extended constantly, because it would just be too expensive to do so. So basically, the municipality says that if local wells and septic tanks, for example, local autonomous individual solutions, if they meet the environmental norms, then they can remain as they are. And in fact, Norrtälje, this particular municipality, is the only region the only municipality in the Stockholm region where the number or the proportion of households who have these autonomous solutions is expected to rise and not decrease. So there's this hierarchy of forms of connection, direct connection to centralized networks down to individual solutions with these intermediate collectives in between. This creates some kind of shared responsibility, work, finance, there's a whole series of things, points which I would have developed around in the three cases. So centralized networks, collectives and autonomous households. There's quite distinctive ways in which the people, residents actually engage with infrastructure or actually inhabit, so to speak, their infrastructure. This is not an infrastructure which is taken for granted by any means. So here we have clearly contested suburban infrastructure. There's tensions between population and residential changes, between urban development or urban policy and the sheer heterogeneity of water systems. There are clear tensions over here as well over the constitution of particular spaces, the limits of public service, limits of collectives, limits of resource flows, the limits of the summer house. The summer house becomes some kind of object of contention over its wider meaning, over its space, over its limits. Other actors are constantly contesting the municipality's policy. There's also a whole series of questions which I haven't been able to get into about how the municipality can actually afford to do a 25-year programme costing 1.6 billion crowns. And basically they do this by increasing tariffs for everybody, which leads to a whole series of questions about cross-subsidisation between users who've already actually paid to gain access to the network, and they're basically financing these new populations coming in, often from Stockholm, quite rich households coming in and occupying these previously secondary homes. And it's the existing residents who are paying or partly paying for this. So this leads to a whole series of questions about unfair redistributions. And then there's a whole series of questions again about fragility of the environment, the use of distant water resources. Is this nature speaking or resisting to an infrastructure configuration? And I was going to come back to infrastructure as ordering, circulation and manipulation, or as Easterling's active forms, or as a political situation, as these disputes overflow into a whole series of questions around which basically take the matters beyond the immediate local scale. And I think I'll stop there actually. I can develop these as and when, but I'll stop there anyway. Thanks. I apologise, it always seems very easy to do 20 minutes and then you end up doing 35. So.
Sure. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. And this is the paper that I've been looking for a long time in case studies in terms of learning across the global north and global south, and looking at the differentiation of water infrastructure in the south contra this non-existent urban infrastructural ideal. And right in the south it's often posed as informal, temporary, makeshift, but yet it, questioning the notion of do you need this centralized ideal, and in what ways can water be configured differently to match the socio-political, physical environment. And so I really appreciate your work, but I'm wondering, have you read stuff that is being done in Mumbai or Delhi or Jakarta, in which they talk about this as well, but from obviously a very different point?
Yeah. I probably should do, and maybe because of your comment I will do. Well, I have read the stuff, but I was going to make the point that this is coming after perhaps your paper, coming after a paper on post-socialist infrastructure. I was going to make the point that this is quite a prosaic kind of story of otherwise rich Swedes struggling vaguely to access some kind of service. And they're struggling. I mean, there's a whole series of tensions that I bring up, but the tensions are nothing like the tensions that you see in cities in the south or anything. So this is a very prosaic story, and I feel it's very difficult as a researcher who works in Europe to integrate, honestly, to integrate and to speak to contexts in the south where the struggles and the tensions and the conflicts are other. It's all, I mean, even in Easterling, compared to Easterling's and Barry's work, I think it's a very prosaic story as well. Easterling talks about free trade zones. She talks about the circulation of global norms. Andrew Barry talks about the geopolitical significance of an oil pipeline in the southern Caucasus. This is, kind of this is incremental infrastructure in the suburbs of Stockholm. This is not, but at the same time, the point is that the local matters, infrastructure matters locally here to people, to residents. So there's a tension. There's a methodological tension about reading across north and south, and about what Barry calls abducting from a local matter and create and relating it to the political situation. But it does relate to the political situation or to a variety of political situations.
Can I just add to that, like network of stories in Prague, for example, during communism, I think something like a third of the people owned country houses, and the whole process around building those around making the infrastructure in those places well very informal, because it was an unacknowledged yet allowed way of owning your own house, and so the summer houses became this really important way of that people established a second home away from the kind of prefabricated houses, which, like you said, were also became less important, a means to an end, and then what was more important was the fleeing on the weekend to go to the country house, and the ways they were built, and the ways that people sort of made do with no support. So just to add to the network of stories around that's connected to the summer home, and in that case, it wasn't necessarily some kind of bourgeois privilege. It was something like a third of the population. So there was a real across the board where people had these.
Sure, I mean that's the key point from the Stockholm story, is that in the post-war period there was so much people could access a large number of people could access second homes, and this is now developed into the modern period, and it's becoming a source of tensions in particular local areas. That also brings up points about, I think, in the Malawi paper, about the operating procedures or the operating protocol, the informal protocol, that the transformation from a temporary mode of residence to a permanent mode of residence also creates problems for planners, but it also creates an issue for residents in terms of how they actually learn to use infrastructures and how they actually switch from summer water to water all year round, etc., as well as having to live in a very cold area in winter and not just in the summer.
Just had a question, if you could comment on other infrastructure like transportation infrastructure, whether or not that plays a role in either sort of reinforcing the sort of informality and fragmented nature, or was there actual regional policies that facilitated people using these summer homes and traveling to them?
The accessibility of this municipality in the northeast, it's 70, 80 kilometres from the city centre of Stockholm, but there are good transportation links. It's on a motorway, but there's also good bus links. This facilitates people actually moving out from Stockholm, where there is a serious housing shortage, where the availability of accessible, inexpensive homes is a real issue. So you have a large number of commuters now moving out, or have already moved out into this area, and who can commute. We saw them, at 8 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning, waiting for the bus to get into central Stockholm to go to work, and coming back out 80 kilometres again in the evening. So the transport effectively reinforces the transformation of the mode of residence. It also legitimizes the municipality's growth agenda in some ways, because they do want these 20 or 30,000 extra residents, because it creates tax it creates tax privileges for them, or creates tax revenue for them, which is why they can effectively afford to spend 1.6 billion crowns, which is about 170 million euros. I don't know what in Canadian dollars, but 170 million euros on a 25-year project. They can afford to invest in this because they know they're going to get the tax revenue, because they're quite well connected, they're quite, etc. So.
If I may,
Pierre.
I don't agree that it's prosaic case.
No, I don't either. But I was going to say it was a prosaic case, but then I thought I wouldn't, mainly because what Roger said as well.
But in a way, sure, it's not a matter of life or death for people involved in the case of Roseanne, which is certainly a difference with what's happening in the global south situation. But it's polluting the Baltic Sea.
Sure.
The Baltic Sea, so, you know, sewage, whether it's rich or poor, has basically the same effect. And also, it is all about the lifestyle that is very important to the people involved. I'm sure this, you know, when the issues flare up, it's probably one of the main importance in their life at that time.
Sure. I mean, for a number of reasons, this, which translate their local matters into political situations, the pollution of the Baltic, whole questions around finance and the redistribution of resources between members of the same municipality or the same society, etc. Questions of responsibility given to residents, etc. I mean, for a whole series of reasons, this is not a prosaic case. This matters to local people, but it also translates into issues of wider suburban significance. This is storytelling about, or the local municipality's plan is storytelling for 2030, how they want their municipality to look, how they want residents to live. So it's a kind of incursion on modes of residence, and effectively not everybody agrees with it. So that's for a whole series of reasons it's disputed, contested, etc.
Led itself to a great comparative study.
Sure.
You know, global north, global south. So that would be a typical global north.
I've been noting things down all day from everybody's presentation, so I think we are beginning to, well, I'm beginning to see connections to a whole series.
Just a quick one to try to tie in a few of the things. I was very interested in your presentation. Thank you very much. The difference between large central systems versus smaller individual systems, in the way you're bringing that point up too, makes me want to ask just simply about if you could ruminate on the issue of risk distribution. My thinking is that if you are going off-grid in Sweden, you are putting yourself in a situation where you're taking the risk upon yourself for the quality of the water you're drinking, let alone what's happening with your septic system if it works, versus a municipal system where the state, and Sweden's relatively controlling compared to Malawi, would take on the risk. And I'm just wondering if risk is any part of this discourse for you. In the stuff I've been looking at, risk there's a great quote, a colleague, Robin Delamott, got it. The people of Gdansk would sell their souls to the devil if only they could get water pressure. So, risk was sort of.
Yeah, I'd have to think more about that. I think the main issue that we came across was we were between the hierarchy of solutions, so to speak. It was an economic calculation that households were calculating in relation to where they actually lived spatially within the municipality, how the distance that they lived from the centralised pipes and installations. They made an economic calculation about whether it was cheaper for them to connect or whether to group together with their neighbours to create this kind of collective co-property kind of solution, or whether a well and a septic tank in their garden was the more acceptable financial case, because in that case you don't pay the rates you don't pay the tariffs to the municipality, you just pay for a control fee, I think, for checking the quality of the water and for checking the.
So there is a fee.
There's a whole operating procedure on behalf of the municipality who has to check the water regularly, who have to check to safeguard the quality of the wastewater service or solution that they have in the garden, that the septic tank is effectively not going to seep into the Baltic, etc. And that changes as well when people start to want to transform their home, if they have to put in a new construction permit or whatever, then the municipality again has to come out and check whether these installations, this infrastructure solution is adequate or not. So it's not necessarily risk in the minds, a wide consideration of risk in the minds of the households. It's a calculation in some ways, at least in the short term.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Johnathan.